A lot of us know that we're already in some sort of a recession. A lot of people in my comments even think that this is already a depression and the recession has been over for a long time, and it's actually much worse than that. But have you ever considered that maybe we've been in a recession for 5 years or maybe even longer? And I never thought about it like this. I kind of thought that we were in a recession towards the end of 2022, so about a year and a half probably. But if we look deeper into the economic data, we can actually see that maybe we've been in a recession longer than that. And I want to thank Cece. She sent me a story. So let's take a look and see if there's any merit to this, because like me personally, I don't remember feeling anything crazy like being squeezed economically, you know, in a real desperate way prior to COVID. Like that really changed everything. And that's when we saw inflation go through the roof over the last few years. But prior to that, I felt like life was pretty normal, wasn't too hard. Like, you know, of course you got to make your money to get by, but the cost of living wasn't going up exponentially. The rent cost wasn't going up exponentially. Things were pretty stable before that. What this story says is we need to look at inflation relative to GDP. So the example they give in this story is, let's say inflation went up by 35% over the past few years. And if that was the case, then when you factor in the GDP figures, then we've actually been in a recession for 5 years, because that would mean we had negative GDP growth over the past 5 years. And this is because the official growth numbers are discounted by inflation. You know, if growth was 3%, but inflation was 2%, we grew. If inflation was actually 4%, we shrank. And the problem is we never really know what the true inflation numbers are, because depending on which source you look at, they're different. And the way that the government calculates inflation today is not the same as it was, you know, 20 or 30 years ago. But I've showed you guys many times in the past that if we looked at inflation and how they calculated it 20 or 30 years ago, according to shadow stats, it means that we would still be, you know, close to double-digit inflation today. And if the current GDP figures, I think they just came out for the first quarter of this year, was that like 1.4%, something like that, that means we would be big time negative. But even just using the official numbers, right? Let's say the GDP was 1.4% for the first quarter of 2024, but we have inflation right now. The most recent inflation report came out at 3%, guys, which means we are still actually negative when you factor in inflation. And then we can look at a few other data points, like the fact that manufacturing orders have been flat over the past 3 years, while consumer spending has actually gone negative over the past 3 years. So that's not a good direction for things to be headed. And then you have things like, you know, people not even eating at McDonald's anymore because it's too expensive. We see the credit card debts and all the other forms of debt skyrocketing. Meanwhile, the delinquencies are skyrocketing, different things. And then the other problem is we can't even trust GDP, because GDP includes all the government spending as well as all the money they've been spending recently on all the immigrants entering the country illegally, the wars that are happening in Israel and Ukraine. All that stuff counts towards GDP, which it shouldn't, because we're not, you know, actually getting anything out of this. We're just giving money away, but it goes into the GDP figures and they're still not good. That just goes to show you how bad things really are. This whole $2 trillion budget deficit that we have right now in the US has boosted GDP by 7% over the past couple of years, but it's not actually making us richer. This makes us poorer, because it's dragging the country down into levels of debt that we're never going to be able to pay back. And by the way, guys, anybody who knows the Bay Area, you can tell I'm in Sausalito today. And out of all the times I've ever visited here, this is literally the hottest I've ever seen it. Like, I figured, okay, today's gonna be the hottest day of the week. Got another wave of the heat wave coming in, and Sausalito will be cooler. Nope, it's like 85 degrees in Sausalito. Still much cooler than Miami. I'm not complaining. I'd much rather still be here. But the fact that it's this warm here is unbelievable. I mean, usually it's in like the high 60s here. So here's the crazy thing also that we need to think about. these numbers already look bad when looking at the official numbers, but if these official numbers are wrong and inflation is worse than what we're being told, which is most likely the case, then we probably are actually in a depression or heading into one. So I think we might have actually skipped over recession and maybe heading into a depression instead. Which brings me to my next point. The inflation numbers just came out this week, and whoopity-doo, we're down to 3% now. The expectation was that it was going to come down to 3.1%, so better than expected, right? But still not so good, because we're still a full percentage point away from the Fed's goal and their target of 2% inflation. So of course the Fed and the government, everybody is celebrating this and thinking that we're almost out of the woods. But it's funny because no one's actually acknowledging the fact that inflation hasn't actually moved in the last year. Okay, when we take a look at this chart straight from the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, okay, this shows you that back in June of 2023, inflation was at 3%, okay? And then it started going back up and slightly coming back down. But now, just a year later, as of the June numbers for 2024, we're right back to 3%, guys. But somehow that's good news that it fluctuated upwards and then has come back down to 3%. But one thing that you have to remember is that even though these numbers are probably fake, let's imagine for a second that they're actually real, then inflation and prices across the board have still gone up 3% year over year. That's what this recent inflation reading means. Now, you know which one of these figures is the worst right now when it comes to inflation? Surprise, surprise, shelter costs. That's still up 5.2% year over year, meaning it's still becoming more than 5% year over year more expensive for people to have a place to live, guys, which is pretty much the number one thing most people need besides food. And of course, the White House is celebrating this like this is some kind of a success, guys. Like, it's not a success that people are paying 5.2% more year over year for a place to live when wages are barely even going up by that amount. You know, businesses are being hurt by this just as much as regular people are. In fact, when they talk to different business owners across the country, they tell the news things like, well, it's easier to hire somebody now than it was a year ago, but these companies are struggling to stay in business because the rising cost of staying in business. You know, like, even though they don't have as much of a shortage with help like they did a year ago, now they're struggling to just keep up with the cost. So if you think about it and you're a business right now, you're in a situation where your cost of doing business is continuing to rise, but you can't raise your prices any more than you already have, because then you risk losing more of your customers, which will make business suffer even further. So this is really bad news for people trying to keep their costs under control as a business. But here we have the White House and the Fed celebrating like somehow they're doing a good job, guys, and they're not. This is also why I said it doesn't matter, you know, who is the next president, because they're not going to be able to get this issue under control. You can't print $6 trillion and expect everything to just go back to normal a couple of years later, especially with interest rates not being high enough to make that happen. I mean, if you take a look at this annual inflation chart that goes all the way back to 1970, you can see that even right now, this is really the worst inflation that we've had since about 2010, not counting the big spike in inflation during COVID, which obviously does count, but now inflation is supposedly normalizing, right? That's what they're celebrating. And it still hasn't been this high in almost 13 years. And then if you take a look at this second chart here, this shows you the monthly increase in inflation, and the only month that it went negative was recently, okay? Before that, they were all positive months of inflationary growth. Even before the pandemic, you know, before the pandemic, we still had inflation going up, and then it went down for a couple of months there right after the pandemic hit. But after that, it's been going nowhere but up or staying flat, guys. So I don't see how this is good news unless we see this chart showing multiple months of inflation coming down negative, which would be deflation in the end. this is not going to be good news. And you know who else is going to suffer from this a lot? People who are reliant on Social Security. Because now that this inflation reading came in lower than expected, another thing that's going to be lower than expected is the cost of living adjustment for people who are living on Social Security. So this all has repercussions, you know, one way or the other. You can't have it both ways. You can't have inflation supposedly coming down and being a good thing and expect to get huge cost of living adjustments. It just doesn't work that way. So after this latest reading, they're saying that Social Security recipients can expect their monthly checks to increase by about 2.63%, which is unchanged basically from the 2.57% it forecasted last month. So barely a 2.5% increase, and which is underneath the inflation number, by the way. Even this supposedly good inflation reading that came in at 3%, as far as I can tell, 2.67% is still lower than 3%. But here's the other thing that happens. The Social Security Administration uses a different way to calculate inflation and how they're going to give cost of living adjustments, okay? And according to their adjustments and data, between January of 2020 and December of 2023, the CPIW is what they call it, increased 20%, while the cost of living adjustments only went up 19%. And since you know that all these numbers are fake in terms of inflation and way underreported, it's reasonable to say that people who are using Social Security to get by are being completely slapped in the face right now and getting hit with higher expenses more than anybody. According to a recent survey, 34% of retirees said they had recently visited a food pantry or applied for food stamps over the past 12 months. And about 50% of senior households depend on Social Security as the difference between staying in or out of poverty. So clearly, people who are relying on Social Security are just getting poorer and poorer by the year right now. But you should be happy because the government, you know, the White House, the Fed, they're all saying things are going great and inflation's headed in the right direction, guys. So to me, the only way inflation's ever going to be heading in the right direction is if we start seeing deflation. But hey, that's just my opinion. And I'm pretty much convinced that the Fed is just lying about everything too. You know, Jerome Powell spoke the other day, testified in front of Congress, talking about how, you know, America's labor market is back in balance. Okay, that's why less people are able to get good jobs right now. That's why less people are able to quit their jobs for a better one. And that's also why the unemployment rate is going up. But in the Fed's eyes, that's actually a good thing because that's what they wanted, remember? Because part of the reason they've kept the rates higher for longer is because the labor market has been too hot, right? But now it's cooling off because unemployment's going up. And now a lot of economists are even getting spooked to the point where they're saying the Fed should start cutting rates already ahead of this because now that unemployment has spiked so much over the past few months, it's probably just going to be a matter of time before it skyrockets because that's what happens every single cycle when we see unemployment go up to this level. But Jerome Powell says that the labor market appears to be fully back in balance. He told the Senate that the labor market is no longer a source of broad inflationary pressures for the economy. Don't have to worry about that either. So we can just focus more on inflation now and forget about the job market because more people don't have a job anymore. So now a lot of people are thinking that there's going to be a September rate cut. And honestly, if things keep being reported like this and we keep seeing the unemployment rate tick up, there very well may be. You know, for a while, a lot of people were thinking there was going to be no rate cuts this year, which is still a possibility. But now that unemployment is kind of like front and center of this data, I think that there may actually be a rate cut this year. But will it matter is the question, and the answer is probably not. And believe it or not, senators on both sides of the aisle actually agree that what the Fed is doing is probably hurting the economy, okay? Because on the Republican side, Senator John Kennedy said, I know you're going to do this anyways, but I'd be really careful about this economy. People just don't feel better off today, meaning that they're going to do what they want with interest rates. You know, they're going to probably keep them a little high still and not going to lower them. As if they did lower them, that magically that would make things better for everybody. It wouldn't, right? But on the Democrat side, you have Senator Chris Van Hollen said that I think this data indicates we are now at risk of not acting soon enough to curb the increase in unemployment, and that if we allow that to go too long, we may see a real uptick there, which probably also will happen. The Fed will probably be late to the game like they usually are when it comes to lowering rates, and it's going to be too little too late, just like it was when they were too little too late with raising the rates. So just like I've been saying, they're in this situation where damned if they do and damned if they don't, guys. It doesn't really matter when they lower rates or what's going to happen with that, because either way, it's going to cause a lot of trouble in this economy. It's just pick your poison. You want higher inflation or you want higher unemployment? You're going to have to pick one, because you cannot bring both of those things down simultaneously. The Fed doesn't have the power to do it. And it's funny because since the Fed is now thinking that the labor market is cooling off and things are going well, oh, it's cooling off, all right, because take a look at this. Because the jobs numbers for the first 4 out of 5 months of 2024 have actually been revised down, meaning the jobs that have been created have not been as plentiful as what they've been telling us it is. The largest revision on the table was from January of this year, where they said we had 353,000 new jobs, but it got revised down to 256,000, guys. That's a 97,000 job difference, meaning basically sliced 1/3 off of what they said it was. And if you say that they're wrong by 1/3 on everything, that means inflation is probably wrong by 1/3. That means unemployment's probably wrong by 1/3. And a lot of these figures that we rely on are wrong by 1/3, if not more. So you had April and May that were revised down by 67,000 jobs and 54,000 jobs. What's the trend here? All the revisions are for downward revisions. It's not like they're revising it up saying, oh, we made a mistake, that there was actually a lot more jobs created than we initially thought. No. But then if you start looking at things through this lens, I think it makes even more sense than ever that, yeah, maybe we really have been in a recession for the past 5 years. It just hasn't been that noticeable because of how much the government stimulates the economy. And if they weren't doing any of this stuff, it would have been noticeable all along. But now they've already overstimulated it to the point where they can't do it anymore. It's only just now becoming apparent that this is the case. So if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And if you don't want to wait for my next video to come out, check out this one on the screen right over here, and I'll see you in the next one.